who the top players are. We're going to our 5-star breakdown, and as we get ready, let me tell you a little bit more about number 32 on this list. You already saw him here on the show, 5-star tight end Lincoln Cure, who is locked in with the home state school, Kansas State. His background as a farmer, as he told me, does translate to his reputation as a bruiser on the field. Here is Andrew Ivins with more on the 5-star tight end.
Lincoln Cure, a utility man on Friday nights all the way out there in Kansas when he's not doing farm work. He's getting it done on the gridiron. Kid that's played wide receiver, quarterback, safety on the defensive side of the ball, and he's just a special athlete. He'll slam home some alley-oops on the basketball court, but he was a state champ in the 110-meter hurdles, projects as a potential field stretcher that can break free over the seam, excellent body control. He's built to handle a high volume of targets. We see more offenses at the collegiate and professional level looking for that cheat code at the tight end position. Lincoln Cure might be the next one.
All right, that starts us off at number 32, but looking at 32 through 21, we just talked about Clemson, so we might as well mention their 5-star and defensive lineman, Amari Adams. What do you like about him?
Well, this is a guy that Clemson has done a tremendous job recruiting in years past. I mean, you think of what they've brought in. Peter Woods is kind of the first name that comes to mind, but this dude checks all the boxes, 35-plus inch arms, play the 1 technique, can play the 3 technique, and a 4 down front. This type of versatility, this type of ability to push the pocket from the interior, I think is really, really important. Clemson's got no issues recruiting the defensive line. I know I was kind of harsh on them there in the last segment, but in terms of what they do in the front 7, they're going to continue to do good work there.
I like that Texas A&M completed the trade with USC and getting Jerome Miles as a player to be named later. Yep. That's on Longstreet. I mean, there was talk that they could unite at USC. There was talk that, when Texas A&M looked like they were in the lead early on, they could play together at A&M. Well, they won't be playing together at all with Miles going to Texas A&M, but an elite sprinter. He missed the majority of his season with a knee injury. We won't get to see him in San Antonio, which is a bummer, but this is a extremely talented player with the size, the speed. You see the comp to Rome Odunze, very similar type of player, just a great ball catcher, the kind of guy that can really be a difference maker for an A&M offense that really needs an explosive playmaker with that size to be able to withstand a lot of the physical DBs that you're going to see in the SEC, with the speed that could outrun those guys. But as he progresses, as he rehabs, I think he's going to be a huge pickup for Mike Elko and that offense, and for Texas A&M to get him away from USC when it looked like, the Trojans are going to be able to hold on to him and add another quarterback to the arsenal with Hassan Longstreet. That's a big pickup for the Aggies.
Another player you wanted to mention, too, was Lamont Rogers from Mizzou. I know we're going to talk a lot about this Tigers class in a little bit, but what excites you most about him?
Now with the Aggies, flip yesterday. Lamont Rogers, I think one of those guys, I talked about it a little bit, 6'6.5", 311. I mean, this is what you look for in the prototypical tackle. The other thing about him, plays center on his basketball team, also plays goalie on his soccer team. So when you talk about these dancing bears and those ballerina feet, that's exactly what he is. So I think Texas A&M going to have some guys that we're going to move on, play on Sundays there at the tackle spot. I think they're going to look for some early contributors, and you look at a guy like Lamont Rogers, who's a little bit of a guy that we're taking a calculated shot on in terms of a 5th star, but we like him because of the physical clay, and then you start thinking about that multi-sport background as well. I mean, the sky's the limit for him.
A lot of Aggies on this 5-star list. Let's continue to move down to players 20 through 11. But before we do these breakdowns, let's go to Andrew Ivins on interior offensive lineman Michael Carroll.
Michael Carroll, I call him the forklift in the middle. Transfers into IMG Academy for his senior season, and what he put on tape, he's the most polished guard tackle. He's got tackle size. He wants to play on the interior. We're okay with that because when it comes to pinning and pulling and getting to the second level, not many can tattoo linebackers like Michael Carroll. It was Evan Neal, J.C. Latham, Tyler Booker, Francis Mawanoa, Jordan Seaton. They all came out of IMG Academy. Michael Carroll's the next one up.
Speaking of human forklifts, Zayden Walker seems like a guy that can move some bodies. What do we like about the number 1 linebacker in this class?
One of my favorite players in the cycle, and I feel like I keep repeating myself, but you watch this guy, 3-phase player, what he can do, rush for 13 touchdowns. This guy was born to play at the University of Georgia. The player comp for us is Jalen Walker, and one of the reasons we went with Jalen Walker is because of the ability to be an on and off ball kind of specialist. They can use him in pass rush situations. You can also drop him as a second second-level defender. You talk about an instinctual player. I talk about this all the time with second-level defenders. You want guys that play as fast as they process. That's why Zayden Walker, outside of all the physical attributes, is one of the best players in the country and the number one linebacker in the country.
Speaking of physical attributes, I'm a big Dejoun Lee fan, the number one player in the state of California. And you think that with the cradle of quarterbacks that California has become, I mean, it wasn't long ago that you had the number 1 and 3 players in the state being the number 1 and 2 picks in the draft 3 years later. But staying in Southern California with Dejoun Lee, going to Alabama, this is a player that, Coop said it earlier, this is an indictment on USC. They usually had great success at Mission Viejo, and then their 2 best players are going to Alabama and Ohio State respectively. But Dejoun Lee is the long, lengthy corner that could be the next Orange County corner for the Tide, with Damani Jackson and Xavier Brown already there. One of the top jumpers in the country. Was a state champion last year in the triple jump and the long jump finalist. But that long physical guy could play really any spot in the secondary, but he wants to camp out at corner, and just a player that I think you continue to see him get better as a football player, not just as an athlete, but becoming a pure football player as his career really developed at Mission Viejo.
Clearly, the scouting team agrees. He moved up 16 spots in the last ranking. What do you think of Lee?
I like him. 6'4". We kind of comped him to Derwin James. That was kind of the name that came up, the former All-American at Florida State and a guy that went in the top 20 of the NFL draft with the LA Chargers. And you think about DJ Lee, I think the biggest question has been there's never been a 6'4" corner that's been drafted in day 1 of the NFL draft, so maybe that gives you a little bit of pause. The thing that makes us feel more comfortable about that is I think his future home is at safety. DJ Lee probably doesn't want to hear that, but at some point I think that's going to be a pretty natural transition. And the other thing about him, it's hard to find corners with his size, his length, his reactionary athleticism that play as physical as he does. He is very comfortable in man coverage. He loves taking away space. Super instinctual guy in the short to intermediate part of the field. I think he's going to be just fine.
You mentioned his unprecedented height as it relates to the first round of the NFL draft. I'll go ahead and remind the people that the 5 stars are based on who we think will be a first-round draft pick when they come out of school. So these are all first-round draft pick projections. And with that, let's move on to players 10 through 6. We're getting close to the top 5, but if you are a top 10 player in the country, you are pretty good at football. So let's go to Andrew Ivins on Georgia edge rusher Isaiah Gibson.
Isaiah Gibson out of the state of Georgia, long limb pass rusher with some position flexibility. Going to be fun to see where he kind of settles in on Saturdays and potentially even Sundays. All right, is he an on-ball guy, off-ball guy? Could he potentially be a 4-eye, 36.5-inch arms to go along with a 4.54 in the short shuttle? No issues finding a flat back. And really what stands out is his ability to flush out pockets with that upfield burst. Likely going to need some time before he's ready to go in one of these big power conferences, but monster ceiling, especially with that reach.
Elsewhere in this range, in big power conferences, Tennessee landing the number 1 offensive tackle in David Sanders. What excites you most about his projection at the next level?
This is a prototypical left tackle. You look at what we had with Josh Connolly 3 years ago. He ended up our number 1 tackle, getting great reviews, will probably be one of the first tackles picked this year. Well, David Sanders is even better as a high school player. This wasn't a guy that you were projecting him necessarily to be at his best. He's been fantastic during his high school career. A great athlete, a two-way lineman, was this reigning state player of the year in North Carolina, but this is a franchise left tackle. This is the guy that you want protecting your pride and joy at the quarterback position. Maybe he slides in next year with Nico for his last year at Tennessee, but this is exactly what you want as a offensive tackle as an offensive line coach. You want a guy that can plug in and play right away, that it won't be a challenge to go up against those SEC pass rushers. He's got the size, he's got the athleticism, he's got the feet, he's got the strength to be an impact player from day one, and this is a guy that I think will have a very short stay in the green room in 3 years from now. If I remember right, he was the number 1 player in our initial top 100 for the 2025 class 2 years ago. Stayed in that top 5. Obviously, it's a quarterback-driven era. The quarterbacks are going to move up. You've got guys like Devin Sanchez that have moved ahead of him, but he has maintained his spot as the premier offensive tackle in this class for 3 years, which is really hard to do at a position that's a lot of times tough to project. This is a guy who was not tough to project, and I think is going to make a lot of Tennessee fans happy. Should he stick it out with Ohio State kind of coming in late, if he sticks with the Vols, then I think that Josh Heupel's got to be very thrilled with his signature.
Going to have to add some weight, but a guy that we like, two-way snaps, protected. Jaden Davis now at Michigan, a guy that I'll go with. How about Justice Terry, 6'4 1/4? We talked about the 5-star that's uncommitted. Is it going to be Georgia? Is it going to be Auburn? And, was banged up throughout the year, didn't play as much, but a guy that we are super high on. When you see the frame, a guy that is long, athletic, lean, 36-inch arms, which is crazy for a guy his size. I talked a lot about Elijah Griffin in terms of the versatility, a guy that can play inside all the way out on the edge. That's why guys value a guy like Justice Terry, can play in a 3-down front or an even front as well. So Justice Terry, one of those guys, I think the arrow is pointing up. Excited to see him healthy, getting on the field. I think he's going to need a year to get right, but certainly one of those guys with a very, very high upside.
We expect him to make his decision on Friday. Again, this is day one of the early signing period, but this is where most of the action happens. And when it happens, we will bring it to you here live on the 24/7 Sports YouTube page throughout the day. Without further ado, let's show you the top 5 players in the country as it stands. And starting with the number 1 player in quarterback, Bryce Underwood, making a lot of headlines 2 weeks ago when he flipped to Michigan. Let's hear from Andrew Ivins on the top player.
Bryce Underwood, I think you can call him the franchise. 6'3", 215 pounds. He can dunk in basketball. He can do a backflip. This is a kid that went 52-4 as a starting quarterback, threw for over 10,000 yards during his prep career, close to 150 touchdown passes. He can make all the throws, right? Crisp mechanics, but he's really turned into a dynamic runner as a senior. Just felt like he was toying with defenses at times. Tons of field command, tons of pocket confidence. Reminds me a lot of Vince Young. And what's crazy is I think Bryce is a better passer at this stage, and he's only going to get better in the coming years. Type of kid we're going to be talking a lot about, not only in 2025, but 2026 and beyond.
All right, you mentioned David Sanders at one point was the number 1 player. Bryce Underwood, of course, taking that spot. But Coop, how close was the race for the number 1 player? When you got 3 QBs at 1, 2, 3, there's got to be some discussion, right?
Not really close.
Really?
There was some discussion. I think after the Elite 11 finals, which you can get emotionally hijacked, right, coming off that event. I think the biggest thing is the pads. What do they do on Friday nights? And we saw that with DJ Lagway, a guy that had a really up and down performance in LA. And then you see the senior season kind of quieted all those questions about him. So for us, Bryce Underwood wasn't out there. We saw Tavian St. Clair. We saw Keelan Russell. You go back to the tape, and Bryce Underwood really just kind of put that discussion away pretty early in his senior season. The other 2 guys, I talked about Keelan Russell, but Tavian St. Clair is the guy that is like, okay, what's it going to look like a couple years from now? I could see it going a lot of different ways, but he's going to the right place with Chip Kelly, Ryan Day, Ohio State, obviously going to be surrounded by elite level talent, and Brian Hartline's a receiver room, so excited to see him.
What's interesting to me is that, we talk about those 3 quarterbacks. Elijah Griffin, and you talked about it just a second ago, what they do on Friday nights. What Elijah Griffin has done on Friday nights for his high school team the last 3 years is something that's just, almost a cheat code. Almost 50 sacks in his career, 80 tackles for loss. This is a guy who is not a projection as much as this is production-based. This is a guy with the production and the projection to be an elite player. We talked about earlier when we were talking about Georgia. We talked about those front 7 guys that Kirby Smart brings in and how he has so many college-ready players, but he's got guys that are ahead of him. But this is the caliber of player that Elijah Griffin is, that he may be able to jump those older guys that are in that roster because of how productive he's been. He's been no match for offensive linemen. They had no answer to stop him. And that's something that if you're an opponent of Georgia, you're like, goodness gracious, he's got more guys like that coming in the pike. And I think that that's what's intriguing about him. He's got the size. He's already got that quickness, that first step, the jab, all the moves, the arsenal. He's not a guy that's just getting by off of sheer strength. He's got a battery of moves that he can use. He can use his speed. He can use his quickness. He can use his hands. He does all that to get into the backfield to the tune of 50 sacks in a career. That's an incredible high school career. When he's getting double, triple team, maybe even quadruple teamed at times over the course of the last 3 seasons.
50 sacks. It's pretty solid to get in that high school. We'll see what he does at the next level. But as we reach the top of the hour here on National Signing Day on the 24/7 Sports YouTube channel,